Hey, deserving listeners, this is the next chapter in our deep dive on the Menendez brothers. The last episode, the full patron episode, was, 2 or 3 hours long, and we watched a lot of very difficult testimony that Lyle provided in the trial. Berto provided links and timestamps, and we watched a lot, and it was hard to watch. There was a lot of details given by Lyle. Berto, you cried a few times, absorbing the. And let me ask you, what's it like to absorb these extremely detailed, horrific, traumatizing stories?
Yeah, it's okay. So definitely over the years, because we've been doing a lot. Like we do a lot of killer stories and things like that. But my ability and tolerance to these things has actually changed over the years. Basically, I have to be self-aware and check in with myself as I'm doing it, that this is not me being re-abused, and that these horrible things that happen, they are things that we can discuss, that it's okay to discuss them. So it's a lot, I guess it's a lot of self-talk, right? And also, there are moments where I need to take a break. So I did do that through this. There were times where I'm like, I can't. Like, I got to come back to this.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, let's continue, and let's introduce the podcast. This is the Psychology in Seattle podcast, and I'm your host, Dr. Kirk and Humberto. I'm a therapist and professor. Who are you, Berto?
I'm Humberto Castañeda, and I am an inspector for coral reefs.
So take us away.
All right. So I have some questions for you to start with, because like where we ended up last time, if you heard the whole episode in the Patron Zone especially, so the thing took a twist. So far we had this picture in our brains of Lyle and Eric being these spoiled brats who, maybe their father was a workaholic, maybe he was even bossy, but they were kind of spoiled brats who wanted the money, and then they were told they weren't going to get the money, and so then they kill them, and then they try to concoct a story where they were in danger. That was the story. But then this lawyer, who has a reputation for introducing these abuse excuse claims, does that. And so it's like, oh, okay, here we go. But as you start watching the actual testimony, and especially with the 2025 light of day, not the 1993 light of day, that yes, boys and men can be abused. Yes, abuse happens, and all these other things.
Well, another factor is that, as you were saying earlier, it took them years to have the trial, like 3 years or something. And I'm guessing that the defendants did not leak the details of having been sexually abused, as would normally be the case, right? So you have the public just left with the information that you laid out in the first few chapters.
Yeah.
And it's hard to see it otherwise, right? Plus, even if there was some sexual abuse, it's hard to imagine it being this horrific and this extensive, right? And not only just the sexual abuse, but like the sadism of the father, the pleasure of harm and berating and physical abuse, So without those details, what other conclusion would you have, right? So I could see how the public would kind of get locked in on a perspective, and then when these details come out, it would take a long time. They would need a lot of details to be convinced otherwise. And of course, even if they did absorb and even kind of believe, they're like, well, you're still spoiled brats and blaming victims, that kind of thing.
Yeah. In fact, a lot of people were, from the accounts, a lot of people at the time were like, you guys aren't kids. You're like 18 and 20. You could have left, which is true. But it sort of like discounts, if you haven't been abused, or even if you were back then, because you wouldn't even have the awareness, because you wouldn't have been in therapy, all these things, you don't understand that this isn't just like a thing you can then turn off, be like, oh, okay, well, that happened. Anyways, bye, mom and dad, I'm off to my life, right?
Yeah.
Like these aren't, okay. So I have some questions for you. First of all, assume a child is being sexually abused in the house. What signs might you expect to see maybe at school or with others, with friends? Like what kinds of things might be seen, behaviors might be seen by that child?
Yeah.
That wouldn't be surprising.
Well, they're across the board and they're not always present. And there are specifics that I've heard that are unique to each individual. But generally speaking, the kinds of things we're looking for is sexual behavior that is not age appropriate, like a 7-year-old that is talking about intercourse, for example, or describing things in detail.
That literally happened to me.
Yeah.
Because when I was being abused, I was between 5 and 6, and I wrote a love note to a little girl in my class. I don't think I ever gave it to her, thank goodness. But my dad found the love note, and in the love note, again, I'm 5 or 6, I say, I want to make love to you. And my dad asked me about it. He's like, and this is, my dad's a child psychiatrist. You would have, but anyways, he asked me about it. He's like, hey, you wrote this. What do you think this means? And I was like, oh, I don't know. I played kind of dumb, but it was a very unusual thing. In fact, I didn't really know what it meant. I knew that it was being mentioned when I was being abused, and I knew that it was related to the things we were doing. So it was a very odd thing for me to write.
Yeah. And to be clear, you were sexually abused by your babysitter.
Yeah.
She was 8 years older than you.
Yeah.
So that people aren't confused that you're talking about your dad.
Oh, right. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah. So that's one. Another are ones that come to mind have to do more indirectly with just general mistreatment at home. If a child is just generally having a hard time adjusting emotionally, academically, socially, that can be a sign, potentially, not always, of being mistreated at home. If they're sexually exploiting other kids or even physically exploiting other kids in a seemingly intense and ongoing way, it's another sign.
Let me ask you, because one of the things I mentioned in one of the earlier episodes is that Eric, for example, was exhibiting a lot of learning difficulties. Now, learning difficulties can be present, but he had a lot of problems in school. And also that both of them were exhibiting a lot of antisocial behavior in school, and that later it even evolved to breaking and entering into homes and all these things.
And by antisocial, you mean like harming people? Or asocial?
No, both asocial as in they didn't have friends.
Right.
But also antisocial, meaning that they were trying to do things like cheat on tests or break rules, eventually break into houses, those kinds of things. Yeah.
Right. So they're pretty indirect, and you can obviously have a kid that does antisocial things like cheating and lying and bullying and burglaries, and the parents did not abuse them. That can happen for sure. But they're pretty indirect. And this is part of the problem with sexual abuse, is that there's not a lot of ability to passively assess in a child that they have, like if a child shows up to school with bruises, then there's a much clearer indicator of having been physically abused. But sexual abuse, it affects your psychologies, right? Your idea of sex, your idea of your body, your idea of bodies in general, your idea of the rights, that the autonomy that people have, the rights that you have. It infects people. It makes them feel ashamed. It makes them feel like they wanted to do it, and it's the enemy within. It creates an enemy within. That it's not easily seen from the outside. Yeah,
that makes sense. Okay, so now the next question is this: what effect does this kind of abuse, and I mean like severe sexual trauma, sexual abuse, specifically, let's keep it from a family member, maybe even a parent. What sort of effects might this cause later in life?
I mean, across the board, because what we're hoping for in parenting is that the parents are at least average and or good enough, as we say, in that the child is given enough data to develop a working model of self and other, that they're, mostly good and that other people are mostly trustworthy. And then that sets the stage for them to be able to navigate through life. Whereas if you have experiences like this, then the world is teaching you, the complete opposite, that people that supposedly love you, that are close to you, also want to deeply, deeply harm you and are not safe. And that you're not lovable, that you don't deserve safety, that you don't deserve care, that you don't deserve attunement. And that's just the way of the world. That's the way the universe works. You conclude this cognitively, but also neurologically. You start to be locked in on a particular point of view. Even if cognitively later, 40 years later, you're telling yourself, I can trust my spouse. There's no evidence that my spouse is going to hurt me. but 99% of the body is like, you cannot trust this person, particularly the closer you get to them, because those are the people that hurt you the most growing up. So that's a pretty profound effect that can cause all sorts of problems. I mean, not only just like ongoing fear and distress, but it'd be like if you train an individual to associate water with poison, so that as they get thirsty, they seek water or liquids, and the closer they get to it, the more they're convinced that it's poison. So they don't drink the water, right? Or they attack the water, or they take the water and dump it out because it's poison. Well, the body needs water. The body also needs attunement and love and closeness and attachment. And so to teach the body that attachment is poison denies the body and the soul and the mind and the psyche and the development a very important need. So there's this constant drive to approach while being the closer you get, the more afraid you get, right? So that's one. But there's all sorts of other effects too, like confusion about your own sexuality, confusion about your identity, depression, anxiety, dissociation, other personality disorders, So really just everything in the DSM can be, the kind of stuff that they went through can be a factor in it.
I know for me, which of course I suffered only a very time constrained and very small version compared to like what some of these tales, but either way, it traumatized me. And for me, the trauma manifested most many years later. Like there was this weird valley for me where, at least as far as I can tell, I didn't have any obvious effects of that trauma happening in my mid-teenage years, early 20s. And then all of a sudden, it all starts popping out. And for me, it was definitely boundary issues with women, and also very, like you said, very confusing ideas about about sexuality and things like that. And also self-abuse, meaning putting myself in very dangerous and stupid situations.
Right. So the question you asked was, what are the general effects of having a horrific parent that is doing this to you?
And mine was not a
which is
parent.
Completely different. If you had asked me what would be the common effects of having a child go through sexual abuse, but they have loving people at home, then I would describe what you went through, which is that you generally are functional, but you have impulses of sexual exploitation, that you have a desire to harm, that the adult symptoms are more limited to sexual confusion and exploitation and putting yourself in harm's way. But you didn't ask me that question. You asked me about basically complex trauma.
Yeah, because that's what these two allegedly went through. And I was trying to associate it to my, of course, like you said, there's a huge difference. But it's important, it sounds like, to really emphasize that there's that compounding effect when the abuser is actually your parent.
Yeah, it makes it 1,000 times worse.
Okay.
Like imagine if it was your dad that was doing, and your grandma.
Oh my God.
And you had no one to depend on. Just how much that would mess
impossible.
you up. Yeah. All right. Well, let's take a break first, actually,
Yeah,
because we're at that point. All right, we're back from the break. Take it away, Berto.
All right. A couple more questions for you. What drives high achievers? And I asked this in the context of we saw how Jose was himself a high achiever. I mean, like crazy to come to this country with nothing and not speaking language and then end up CEO of big companies, all these things. But also that he was trying to drive his son, especially Lyle, but both really to be high achievers. But what kinds of things, what kind of common elements might drive a high achiever?
As a parent or as a kid?
In this case, let's take it as a parent, because he's the one, kind of like this idea of like, I didn't accomplish as much, but I wanted to accomplish all of it, and now my son or daughter will be the one.
Well, that's a very specific thing. That's not just high achievers. That's a parent who, I wouldn't call that a high achiever parent. I would call that a parent who is vicariously trying to high achieve through their children, I suppose.
Well, right. I suppose, because it's odd, because by any outside looking in account, like Jose was as high achiever as it gets. You can't be, you can, but barely be more high achiever than that. So, but in his mind, that's still not good enough.
Right. I think a better question is, why do I think the father did this, because to ask generally about high achievers or generally about vicarious parents is potentially going to miss what we're actually witnessing in this family, because with the father, there's a number of things potentially at play. A deep self-hatred that is manifesting in a variety of ways, including a need to signal to the world that he is perfect. There's a narcissism in there, and a need to have his children actually be superior to other people because he needs to be superior to other people, and therefore he needs people to be associated with him also to be superior. At the same time, he needs to be superior over them, that kind of thing. Because narcissism is, once you get into the kind of psychopathy that may be present in the father, or may have been present before he died, narcissism comes along with it, usually, for a variety of reasons, which I won't go into right now. It doesn't always, but we call this a dark tetrad. Psychopathy, narcissism, sadism, and Machiavellianism. When you have all four to a high degree, then you have a big problem. I'm not necessarily hearing evidence of Machiavellianism. Doesn't necessarily mean that it doesn't exist, but definitely sadism, right? The pleasure in harming other people. It's arguable, though, that he was sexually harming people of any age and fantasizing about it, not because he was a pedophile and attracted to kids, but because he just wanted to harm people. And then the psychopathy, the lack of empathy, and then the narcissism involved in here too.
Would this be an example of Machiavellianism? When Jose was working for RCA, one of the things is he wanted to have a lot of record sales because, of course, that would be success. So he concocted a plan that he put into motion where he would simply, when a store ordered records, he would just send them tons of additional inventory that they did not ask for or pay for so that they could write it into the books as more record sales.
That's from my understanding, a common practice in the music industry, and not, you could call it Machiavellian, but you would not see that as any sort of strong evidence of an internal dark tetrad Machiavellian.
Okay, so this one. When Eric was going to go to college, and he would go on to testify that he was, every day this would consume his thoughts because it was finally his escape out of the house. He was going to get to live outside of the house. His father had told him he couldn't go to the college of his choice, which was, I forget which one, but it was like away, that he had to go to the nearby college because he needed to live at home. And that even when he had agreed to maybe let him live on campus, he told him he had to stay overnight at home at least 3 nights a week. So kind of like planning his schedule and making sure that he would be present enough for the alleged abuse. Like, is that kind of planning what we're talking about?
Definitely more in line with it. Mm-hmm. Like a classic case of Machiavellianism that we're talking about when we're talking about dark tetrad is that, let's say that someone in the workplace bothered him and pissed him off or was getting in his way. And he had the impulse in the moment to just like punch the guy in the face, but he doesn't. He goes home and he plans for like a month, and he enacts a plan of maybe even physically harming him. Like, okay, I'm going to distract him, and then I'm going to cut his brake lines, and he's going to get in a car accident, and then he won't come to work, and therefore I'll get an advancement or something. Like, that's the kind of Machiavellianism that we're looking at typically, is that you have someone that instead of acting impulsively in a harmful way, like just taking or punching or stealing or something, they wait. Because for most of us, we can have a moment where we're upset, like road rage or something, and we will, in the moment, be extremely rageful. And if the person was right in front of us, we might yell at them, or we might even push them or hit them or something like that. That's a very different thing than after that wears off, you're still in the mode of, I'm going to fucking get this person.
What was that show we watched? The road rage one, remember?
Beef.
Where it's like you get cut off and then the rest of your existence becomes about it.
Right. So it's one thing in the moment to try to run someone off the road. Not okay. But it's another thing that once the rage subsides, which it almost always does, and you're still determined and you bide your time, that is a problem, right? To have a kid, for example, like you have a kid in your class, you're a teacher, who has bursts of anger, and they're like, oh, that is preferable typically than to a kid that bides their time. And the things that are associated with biding your time is that you probably lack empathy to some extent, because once you're calm physically and emotionally, you still want to harm the other person.
I see.
Yeah, this empathy doesn't kick in once emotions go away, because you baseline want to harm other people, or you baseline don't care about other people. Like for me, if someone cuts me off on the freeway, I might just start yelling and screaming. And if you measured me, I would be extremely rageful and upset. And would I be capable of yelling in a guy's face or flipping him off? Yeah. But after I calm down, I get home and it's the next day or something, and I saw the guy, and the guy I bump into him at the store or something, and I know it's his, I recognize his face. I would not strike him
right.
because I would be calm by that
chilled
point.
out.
or say I knew the guy, like I flipped him off, and I like, oh wait, I know that guy. He works at my office, and then I see him the next day. Typical people will have calmed down. They're not going to have the same rage. They're not going to have the same motivation as when they were in the passion of their anger. Whereas for the Machiavellian people, for the sadistic, psychopathic people, they will retain that motivation. And so it manifests in Machiavellian. It's not a motivation to plan. It's a motivation to harm and a lack of empathy that results in planning. You know what I'm saying? Just because someone plans a problem doesn't mean that they represent the Machiavellianism.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
That makes sense. Okay, cool. By the way, part of the reason I was asking about high achievers, it was a little it was separate from the obvious narcissism and abuse and all these things. It still fascinates me that someone could do so much starting from so little, and why they would push themselves so hard.
Yeah,
right?
well, let me talk. So
Yeah.
that was your original question. So this is me without any prep, just rambling, which isn't great content, but this is what you got, people, is that all parents, to some extent, live vicariously through their kids. This is not a strange thing. We know the extreme, horrible examples like what we're hearing in this family. But all parents do. And we don't really want parents to completely dissociate from their kids, right? If your kid, for example, does well on a test or in sports or something, you want parents to feel personal pride in that. It doesn't make a lot of sense, but what it points at is a connection that parents just innately feel with their kids, that they are a part of them. Now, of course, this can be taken too far, right? So the impulse is normal. Where it manifests in problematic relationships or with problematic parents is that it can become a problem. So that's one thing. The other thing is that if you hate yourself, as narcissistic people always do deep down, then you have a deep need for everything to be constantly looking good to the outside and, pushing a child, and hating yourself for not achieving as much as you think you need to. That's the thing about narcissistic people that TikTok doesn't seem to understand, is that it doesn't justify being narcissistic, but the individual is in a constant state of feeling like they are inferior, like drastically inferior. So they're in a constant state of trying to reassure themselves and other people that they're not inferior. And the only way to because like how do I establish that I'm not inferior, right? How do I do that? Like it's proving a negative, right? I'm not inferior. Well, the only way to prove to people that you're not inferior is to prove that you're superior, right? You can't walk around going, by the way, I'm not inferior. I'm not below average. I'm not below, you need to show, and,
right.
and it's also convincing of the self. So for the narcissistic person, they might become extremely pressuring to a child to prove to the world that
we are not inferior.
That you're superior, which means that I'm superior because I raised you and you're a part of me and this family is superior. I need that constantly to be true. So that's another thing. The other thing is just immigration, like with my family, my Japanese side. I don't know what was going through people's minds, but they were being treated poorly in the early 20th century by society and by the law, by the way. They were legally not allowed to own land in Washington State. People born in the United States, not, my family were farmers and in Central Washington, and they were denied that because white people, politicians and voters made that so. Anyway, So you look for any way to have some kind of self-esteem, not only as a person, but also as a group, as a racial group. And one of the places that it doesn't matter what the color of your skin is sports. And this is true today, but it was true back then. And my grandpa was a star. And it was great to have a family, if you were my grandpa's brothers or parents or whatever, it felt good.
Which sport again was it?
It was all the sports.
All the sports, okay.
Literally. I mean, mainly baseball, but it was football, it was soccer, it was basketball, golf.
He's just like an all-around.
Yeah. And so not only was that celebrated just because it would normally be something that you'd be proud of, but for the Japanese American community, because, the headlines were Honda, my grandfather, it would be Honda defeats so-and-so, like a white guy. And to have that in the newspaper, right. Japanese defeats the whitey, right? Oh, that feels good. You know what I mean? And so, maybe the father had some kind of chip on his shoulder about that. I don't know.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay. Yeah, I guess there's a version of this story. You could have imagined a version of this story that didn't include murders, didn't include sexual abuse, that still included an immigrant having achieved very highly, and maybe not being as present for their family or whatever, but still. And in those cases, a lot of the things still apply. Like I want to do better than where I came from, or maybe I want to demonstrate that we are good people too, or whatever. That might apply. Okay, so one last question here before we move on. One of the things I mentioned in the last episode was that Jose, the father, even though he was abusing his male children, definitely did not consider himself a homosexual, and in fact hated homosexuals, according to his... Again, all this is alleged, but according to Eric and Lyle, that was the case. And given the time and the machismo culture he came from, I would not be surprised at all, right? How does someone how can that be reconciled in someone's brain? Because they are having sex with someone of the same sex, and yet they think they're not into that or whatever, and in fact they hate it. How can that happen?
Well, trying to tease out the father's sexual orientation, given the allegations about him having sexually abused the boys, is an impossible task. And also, we're often on a spectrum, and it's kind of context specific, meaning that you could have someone that will, credibly claim that they're 100% heterosexual, and yet they had experiences in college that they enjoyed. What does that mean? Well, it's not a concrete thing. It's not like looking at a diamond and saying, well, that's all carbon. Right? That's just crystallized carbon. You can't point at an individual and say, okay, we can now take a blood test and you are 95% heterosexual. But for him to claim that he hates gay people, he hates homosexuality, and have sex with his children, his boys, those two things could exist in the same person. Given what I'm hearing about the pornography that was witnessed by other people that the father had and by the kids, that it was a lot of rape fantasy pornography, and it was heterosexual, it sounded like, right? Yeah. That the father, generally speaking, was just a sadistic psychopath, sexual sadist, and that he just wanted to exploit other people, wanted to harm people. He got off on seeing other people being harmed sexually. But if you, separated that somehow from the individual or took that out of him, like that was just like a program that you just deleted or something, is it possible that he would have been completely fulfilled in a very heterosexual lifestyle? Yeah, those two things can exist in the same. Am I making sense?
Yeah. What brought this to mind is I saw an interview with John Wayne Gacy, the clown killer. 33 victims they found. Young adult. Well, some of them were underage actually too, but all men. Yet when he was being interviewed in this interview, he was saying, like, part of it is just his psychopathy, but he was like, all this claims about me being a homosexual, all these things, it's ridiculous, right? And again, it's hard to tease apart how much is just the psychopathy lies versus not. But it felt like quite possible that in his brain he didn't even think of himself as a homosexual, but he was raping and abusing these people. So it got me to thinking, like, these dichotomies that exist in some of these abusers, where they see themselves one way, even though in reality what they're doing. Like, for example, Jose reportedly didn't see himself as an abuser at all. He saw himself as grooming his children to be men.
Right.
In fact, one of the reports from Eric is that one of the reasons Jose didn't like Eric and kind of hated him, unlike Lyle, this is how Eric felt, right? Is that he felt that Eric was gay.
So is it likely that anyone of that age at the time, because he would have been our parents' age if he were still alive today, to have a complicated relationship with homosexuality or same-sex attraction? Yeah. But we also have reason to believe that he was sexually abused growing up. So it's possible that, because he's never been through recovery, I'm guessing, that he had yet to discover his innate sexuality to begin with. So there's that. Is it also possible that if he was left to his own devices and not abused growing up, that he would have been bisexual or something? Yeah, it's possible. It's sort of a nonsensical conversation, because you're listening to a psychopath who has absorbed the homophobia of the time and is regularly sexually abusing one of his children, and he's claiming his sexual orientation. And so, it's like God knows what was really happening with him sexually.
That's incredible. Okay, great. I mean, not great, like horrible. But I want us to move to watching Eric's testimony, which is going to be, if you can believe it, even more harrowing and more horrible than Lyle's testimony. And I think this is a good point to move to our Patreon zone.
Okay, so we will pause here, and the rest of this episode, in which I'm both looking forward to and not looking forward to hearing Eric's testimony. So this will be for patrons of the podcast. So if you want to see this full chapter, I just had something came up in me.
Yeah.
Then you need to become a patron of the podcast. Otherwise, please take care of yourself, because
you deserve it.